Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to ZTV Live. Today is Tuesday, October 5th, 2021, and the new Zebra Press is on newsstands. It came out on yesterday, and it's a wonderful issue. It's a wonderful cover story about a U.S. Army vet named Jay Waters who biked across the country from Washington, D.C. to Washington State, some 3,800 miles he biked, and it's a wonderful story. There's wonderful stories in there as well. You know, the Zebra, we are all about the good news, so please rush out to your newsstand after the show and pick up your copy of the Zebra. You can also read us online at thezebra.org, and you can subscribe to us so you get this wonderful full color, really great newspaper in your right in your mailbox once a month, and it's a great read. There's all sorts of news about events and goings on, restaurants, foodie news in Alexandria, any news that you want to know about in Alexandria. It's all in the Zebra, so you should totally pick it up. Tonight is another edition of one of our favorite shows, Reading, Writing, and Ralph, with our literary editor, Ralph Peluso. Let me bring Ralph right on here. Hey, Ralph, welcome to ZTV.
Hi, Susan. How are you doing tonight?
We're doing just great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And I understand that a pretty savvy journalist wrote that lead story.
That's right. That's right. I got a hot tip, and it turned out to be a wonderful story. Probably one of my favorite stories I've ever had the pleasure of reporting on. So it was really wonderful. Again, I know Jay Waters is a good friend and a neighbor here, and it's just it's an amazing story. And the organization that he did the expedition with, Warrior Expeditions, is a really wonderful outfit. They sponsor vets to go on a cross country, biking trip, or a shorter hike, or a paddling trip, to kind of, they found therapeutic effects in these long distance hiking trips to, help these army guys, kind of adjust to civilian life. So it's a wonderful, wonderful organization.
Congratulations. It was well done. And
Thank you.
one of our good friends, Roseanne Weissman, sent me a present, and that is a zebra tie, which I
That is
plan to wear at the next zebra event. Isn't that
that's
special? Hand painted.
That is
Wow.
Roseanne. She went to Africa and kissed a giraffe and got you a zebra tie. I think that's fantastic.
There it is. Yes. Very nice, Roseanne. Thank you. Now
Yay!
we
Thank you,
have
Roseanne.
and tonight's guest is Elizabeth MacBride, and it's again we're so varied on our topics. Tonight we're
Yes.
talking money, right?
Good.
Economics and money. So it's
Excellent. Let
but
me
this
bring
is
Elizabeth
mainstream
on the
money.
screen here. Here we go.
Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. Hi.
Glad to have you. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing really well. It's been, a work day, and now I'm wrapping it up by joining you on the zebra. And I was saying before we started that I love the zebra, so this is like extra special, exciting for me.
Oh, that's
So
fantastic.
happy to be here.
And our motto is wonderful. Be the good news in someone's life. So
That's right.
we're going to talk about good news as it relates to economy and
Yeah,
finances.
yeah, yeah. That's one of the pleasures of writing this book. Actually, was getting to meet a lot of people who are builders, right? Like the owner of the
Yes.
zebra, a lot of other people in Alexandria. So
That's
Right.
true. That's an
Right.
excellent point. I'm going to let you two take it away from here.
Fabulous. So, Elizabeth, the first question I always ask, and it's so that our viewers can gain familiarity with you, is to tell us about your background, your career, how you got yourself into writing, and then how you picked this topic for this book. I know you co-wrote it with Seth Levine, I think his name is, and
oh,
um,
cool.
and
Yeah.
so tell us about you. Who is Elizabeth MacBride, and how'd you do all this?
Well, I'm a neighbor for one thing. I live here in Alexandria. I live in George Washington Park on top of the hill right behind the Masonic Temple. My kids have all gone to Alexandria schools, and I love this community very much. Um, so, who I am is, I'll start by saying I'm a military brat. And so travel has very much been in my blood from the beginning, which is probably one reason that I became a journalist. So I majored in journalism at the University of Maryland, had my first job at a community newspaper in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, not unlike the Zebra, and then sort of went from there. I graduated into the recession of 91 to 93, which, if you remember, was a very sharp, fast, deep recession. And what it meant for journalists was that there were no jobs. And that's when I took a turn because I needed a job. I took a turn into business journalism, which was the only kind of journalism that was still hiring. And it ended up suiting me. So I have reported on business with detours here and there. Also, I've also written about police and conflict and those other issues around the world, but always with kind of an economic lens, right? Because money really drives everything. Um, and when you realize that, yeah, when you realize that and you want to be a good journalist, you're kind of like, okay, so if I really want to shed light on the truth, I need to understand how money works and money flows. Um, and it's so that has really guided my career. I've always wanted to get to that deeper truth. And that's ultimately how I ended up writing The New Builders. I was in the course of that pursuit of understanding how money works and how business works and how the economy works. I was writing about entrepreneurs all around the world. It's a very shared phenomenon that people start businesses all around the world. Some of them grow, some of them stay small. And I happen to be in Jerusalem working on issues in the Palestinian economy for the United Nations. Um, and I was there writing about Palestinian entrepreneurs. And one of them said to me, "Hey, you really need to meet this American investor, American Jewish investor who's investing in Palestinian entrepreneurs." And that was Seth. And so we became friends. I think we bonded over this joint belief that, in fact, when people have agency and power to govern their own economic lives, it's better for everybody, right? It's very fulfilling and satisfying, and especially today in a big corporate environment, to own your own business. And so we both really believe in that power, and because of that decided to write this book together, which focuses on American small business owners.
Yes, and you're right. Money, it all comes down to money. Interesting backdrop. So when I went to college a few decades before you did,
Thank you.
I went to be a sports journalist, and
Yeah.
and when I had to declare as I was a sophomore, I went to my guidance counselor back in those days. You did all that stuff, and he said, "There's no money in journalism. You can't be a sports writer. There's no money. So go into business." So I became an accountant, and then became an MBA. But he was so wrong that you couldn't make money in sports journalism.
It's exactly right, right? I hate it when
That's right.
people tell young people those stories, right? That you can't make money or you can't build a career in this or that. When in fact, what you really need to be doing is finding something that you love enough to work hard enough at that you can make money doing it, right? And then you'll be
Right.
happy. Yeah.
So here I am, 55, 60 years later, doing what I started out to do with the Zebra. So,
Well, I'm glad
well,
that you came. Glad that you came around and joined us in the writing and editing, because it is a great career. Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So I'm going to remind the audience, we have 3 trivia questions tonight. The winners, each winner will get an autographed copy of The New Builders by Elizabeth MacBride and Seth Levine. I'm going to start out with the first question. It's kind of a tricky question, but let's see who's on their toes out there. And they can use Google on their phones to look things up. We're not strict. We can't monitor them, so just let them do it. So the first question is, what company had the largest IPO ever? So which company had the largest IPO in history? So Elizabeth, of the things that fascinated me with your book is how you drew in the early explorers of North America and the earliest establishers of the United States and the colonies, and portrayed them as New World entrepreneurs. Explain how that to the audience and how that works, because I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, I think it was when we started out to write the book, I said to Seth, we should have one chapter that really talks about the history of entrepreneurship in the United States. And we went out to try and find a book that would help us write that chapter. And what we found, surprisingly, was that no one had ever written the history of it. And so our chapter is an attempt to get at that question. I think it ended up being chapter 7 or something like that. But what we wrote about is the fact that throughout American history, there has always been a business motivation that has served as a backbone or framework or frame for what's happened politically. And so, for instance, the early explorers like Christopher Columbus, was sort of like an early version of an entrepreneur. He went to get financial backing from the King and Queen of Spain. He paid his employees with shares of the profits. Like all of this is kind of how venture capital works today. He's an example. Of course, all of the founding fathers were entrepreneurs. Right here in Alexandria, right, we have the distillery that George Washington started, which was one of the largest in the United States. He's another example. I find it really compelling to think about the fact that the explorers who went out west were also entrepreneurs, in that most of the time they were agents of big land companies, right? So they got a share of the profits for the land they discovered. Understanding all this is kind of like threaded right with our white kind of lens, so that obviously there were people who were on and had the land before these explorers came. And that's again another sort of business thread that wends its way through our history, right? Is that question of how our business enterprises shaped the political system and, in fact, guided, maybe that's the right word, some of the racist institutions of our past, right? The plantations, it was to sustain the plantations that slavery exists. And those plantation owners, for good or ill, were entrepreneurs, right? So you kind of can look at American history through this lens of entrepreneurship. And when you do, there's a lot, I think, that's revealed. And maybe I hope people will read the book, but maybe what I'll say is that one of the things that we found most interesting in surfacing that history is that the stories of women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color are just left out, right? They existed. And in fact, women were starting businesses at even greater rates than men in the late 1800s. They were getting a larger share of the patents. So women were doing tons of interesting work, but that they're just left out of the history, right? And we've decided that whole sectors that were women-owned businesses just shouldn't be recognized as businesses, like midwifery or like owning a boarding house, right? All of these things were in fact entrepreneurial, but we don't think of them that way, and so they weren't really recorded in our business history. And you could say the same for entrepreneurs of color as well.
Yeah, the women, that's a great point you bring up. It probably is linked back to what the culture was, not only here, but across the world at the time. Because even the Constitution at that point in time didn't give any rights to women, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't
Yeah.
think the founders ever foresaw rights being given to women, or they would have approached some of the things in the Constitution a little bit differently. And the same thing with folks of color.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the other things you talk about in the book, it bleeds through the book, is the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. In my lifetime, I've gone through a number of recessions. It's probably 3 or 4, who knows. What is the difference with the 2007, 2008 that we had to label it as the Great Recession?
That's a good question, and a kind of a wordsmithy question, right? Um, well, I call it the Great Recession because I think it harkens back to the Great Depression in that it was so it if to me it feels like a recession that began in kind of on Wall Street, right? But the impact was not felt on Wall Street. It was um, felt in middle class and lower middle class communities across the country, which is why it plays a role in our book. Because when you remember what happened in the Great Recession, right? It was around mortgage-backed securities. So all these banks were essentially loaning money out, and then the credit terms just sort of disappeared, and everyone got their mortgages yanked, and all of that money just like flew out of the system, right? We ended up with these enormous balls of debt that were just kind of passed around the world among the big financial institutions. It
Well, the
was funny
underlying
money.
value of the assets disappeared.
Right. The assets disappeared and the debts did not, right?
Right.
That's exactly what happened. But the people that got hurt were if you remember, were on they were just our neighbors, right? They were our neighbors and friends. And it really hit middle class and lower middle class communities. And what that did in the small business economy is that it meant that people could not borrow against their homes to start businesses. And
Right.
so, for the first time in American history, the rate of small business starts went to negative. There were more folding than there were starting. And that was a terrible, moment for the U.S. economy because so much of our dynamic economy comes from small businesses starting. A lot fold, but a lot start. Right? We need to have a positive net start, and that went away in those years after the Great Recession. So it's a big
Yeah.
problem.
The, yeah. The great buildup of real estate values preceded 2007, as you know, and and then when things started to tumble, they just tumbled very quickly. And you're
Yeah,
right, there was nothing to borrow against, and a lot of people, when they had forced to sell their homes for whatever reason, had to bring a check, you know,
right. They were
which was
underwater. Right. It's
underwater.
terrible. Yeah. When I call it the Great Recession, in my mind, it's a way of giving weight to all that pain, right? To me, it wasn't a normal recession because it hit so hard, right, at really the core of American identity, our homes, our ability to start businesses. So I think it's up there, right, with the Great Depression in terms of being a serious event in our economic history.
Yeah, I think you're right. It did have a big impact, particularly on the real estate market. Um,
Hmm.
and some of those areas have never recovered to the 2008 level.
Hmm.
And they may never do so. Now, how do you already talked about the recession of the 90s. Uh, Talk about 2007 and 8 as a, and how you view the recession of 1981, 1982, 73, 74, which is the first one I remember living through, and that involved wage price controls. And so talk about those three and how you stack them up.
How do I stack them up? Well, 73, 74 is the first one that, but I remember it through the late 70s, right? So technically, I guess it ended in 74, but definitely inflation was going on for a longer time span, right?
Right.
Um, you remember those recessions probably better than I do. So tell me what you think of those compared to
Well,
that
I remember
2000
I
recession.
first went to work in 1972 or 71, and I'm 2 years in, and I'm making all of about $9,000 a year for an accounting company, and
Mhm.
and then they said we can give you $450 a year raise next year because it's 5.5%, right? $450 a year raise.
Right.
So that's my first recollection of the
The bad,
1974
right?
recession, right?
Yeah.
And it did persist. When you went into the 76, 77, 78, it was the misery index. It was the interest rates were in double digits, and inflation was in double digits. And you could take, $1,000 and you put it in, John Hancock Savings Bank at a 3-month CD earning 22%, right?
Mhm.
It was tremendous returns, but the prices and everything were going up just as fast. And you had gas lines, you had everything, through the roof. Um, 81, 82, I don't think it blipped what I did on a daily basis, from what I
Mm.
remember. So, um, nothing like 2007, 2008.
Yeah, yeah. I don't actually that one I was, I guess, in like high school. No, I wouldn't even have been in high school for that. I was late elementary school, I guess, and I don't remember that one. And but I would say, it's interesting to bring up the inflation of the 70s because we are seeing this uptick in inflation now. And I know older people are getting very worried about it, and I don't think younger people have lived through anything like the inflation's a foreign concept to them, so they don't quite understand how bad it can get and why there's this like deep worry about it in our economy. Small business owners know, actually, right? I've done some reporting lately in the past 6 months or so about how these rising costs are really hitting small businesses that are already weakened from the pandemic. So it's a big worry right
Oh
now.
yeah, it is.
Go-
It's very big.
Not,
So,
not in the administration, right? Yeah.
but um, let me move to a different topic within your book, and it struck me. You talk about mainstream investing and what Main Street looks like today, and there's not a lot of attention being paid to it. And I look back, and the experience I draw from on Main Street is I remember what my grandparents and my parents went through. When my grandparents came over, they they came over from Italy. They had very little, um, and they started two businesses. They started a candy store, and my grandfather became the first recycler that I can remember. He was a junk man. He collected junk, newspapers, copper pipes, all this stuff, and sold it. Right? That's what they did. Um, so people started small businesses on Main Street back then, I think, out of need, with
Mhm.
to feed their families. Most of them are having 4, 6, 10 children. Um, to feed their families, provide for their families, give their families a future. Main Street investing today, I think, you can't draw it from the venture capitalists because they're looking for how do you scale this, right?
Mhm. That's great.
So the question is, how do you draw money to the small businessman who just wants a community store, the local bodega, the small restaurant, right?
Yeah.
Whatever it is on the face of Main Street today.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. Um, First, I want to say, how lucky were you if your grandparents owned a candy store? I mean, that sounds like a lot of fun. You were a
Yeah, I was
kid.
60 pounds at 3 years old. So that
Um,
tells you a lot.
So, in fact, it's one of the problems that we write about extensively in the book, although I hope in a readable way, right? People have
Yeah,
told us that the new builders makes a serious and complicated subject readable, which makes me
it does.
happy.
It does.
Um, and so what we write about is that the financing system for small businesses is really broken, right? You hear all this stuff about venture capital, and venture capital does fund important businesses, but only funds about 1% of all startups in the country. So it's tiny. It's a tiny amount. So then the other 99%, what do? Well, only about 15% is able to get a bank loan. And so the other 85, 83% just gets no financing at all. So they're trying to start their businesses based on savings, which most people don't have. Home equity, well, we talked about that, right? In many places that is not really a good option for people. Or they use credit cards, which can be disastrous because of the high interest rates, right? So there's really not a good financing system for small businesses. And the reason that is, again, we can go back to the Great Recession, right? And how profound it was in our country, because what happened in the years running up to the Great Recession and then was exacerbated by the Great Recession is that there was this huge amount of bank consolidation. So we went in the past 20 years or so from having 14,000 banks in our country to having fewer than 5,000. And most of that consolidation was in the community banking sector. Um, and those were the banks that were giving loans to people to start businesses, right? One of the new builders that we write about is Booker T. Wilkins, who owns a barber shop on Queen Street here in Alexandria.
Oh, wow.
And, and he got his start in business. First of all, he had to persuade a white landlord to rent him space, which was a whole ordeal 50 years ago. He's still in business after 50 years. But he also walked down to a community bank. I think it was Burke and Herbert. And he walked in the front door and he said, I would die before I didn't repay this loan, right? He just was face to face with a community banker saying, I am trustworthy. And the community banker took a risk on this young black barber. It turned out to be a very good risk, right? But those kinds of relationships just don't exist in the high enough number that we need them to in our country.
So what's the solution? How do we get more funding into those community banks?
Yeah, it's a big and it's a worth, and there are some other books out there actually, and other people, serious economists. I'm a journalist, right? I'm not an economist or a bank regulator. We do need to pay attention at the level of the U.S. Treasury, at the level of the bank regulators across the states, changing the rules so that small banks don't have to abide by the same onerous regulations as the big banks do, right?
Right.
The four banks in our country control 80% of the deposits. That is kind of a number that I think should just scare people in general, right? Because you do not want to have, that's how we got into the Great Recession in the first place, right? There were these huge entities that really were not, that got too big, and then we had to bail them out. And we're kind of in that situation in other ways, again, where these huge banks have just gotten bigger and bigger and have so much control over the economy. So one of the things we need to do is really seriously look at the bank regulations. I think there are innovative solutions that are starting up, though. There are things like Mainvest, which is a tech business that helps you invest in your own Main Street community. So you can go and say invest $1,000 in the restaurant down the street from you if you've got, if you're sort of a substantial member of the community and you've got the money to do it. And you'll probably make returns that could make that $1,000 investment worthwhile. So that's one solution. There are other community loan funds, which are more like, they're not exactly philanthropies, but you can donate to them, and they play a really important role in supporting small businesses, and they could definitely grow. So there are smart people looking at this problem, but I think one of the big issues is that we're so caught up in our love affair with technology and venture capital and growing these huge businesses that we haven't paid any attention to what's happening and how hard it is today to run a maintenance business. People know it, but they haven't paid enough attention to understand why and to start to change it.
Yeah, that's why I said it's greed versus need. And so the lower end of the spectrum gets shoved aside. If you can't scale it and get it to $1 billion.
Yeah, but why do you think of it as lower? That's one of my fundamental questions, right? Why do we have this concept that Mark Zuckerberg is a great guy, and the restaurant owner is not worth supporting, right? I mean, we're sort of all in this headspace now where we recognize that, like, supporting many of those restaurant owners might be a whole lot better for our country than enabling a Mark Zuckerberg to build a billion-dollar
See,
empire.
I contend that the large corporation CEO and the small business owner CEO have the same problems, except the large corporation CEO has 6 to 9 more zeros at the end. But
Yeah.
it's the same
Oh,
problems.
you think so? I don't.
Yeah.
Okay, talk about that for a long time. I think it's a whole different world. I think that we really help big businesses in today's government environment, um, in ways that we do not help small businesses.
Yeah. So their job might be easier than the small business job,
No,
right?
I think, yeah, yeah. I do think that big CEOs' jobs are easier today than a small business owner.
Yeah.
I would stand by that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the basic point. That guy has to worry about making payroll, and filling out the tax return and making sure he's got his license. CEO has
Yeah,
to worry about it, but he doesn't have to do it most of the time.
that's right. And yeah, there's so many ways we make life harder for small businesses, right?
Yeah, we do. We do.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
do.
Licensing is another one. Yeah.
Yeah, another interesting concept in the book that struck me is you said it's okay to fail. You know,
Yes.
so tell the audience about that. Why it's okay to fail.
So it's so interesting when you look at U.S. history and you realize that, we've always had a kind of special relationship with failure in the U.S. Um, and the studies actually have shown this, over the past few decades, right? That, we had that in the U.S. it was always failure was not regarded as a huge stain against your character, as it has been in other countries and other parts of the world. And you can see it as far back as the middle of the 1800s when we passed the first bankruptcy laws, and made it easier to declare bankruptcy and you didn't get thrown in prison, right? In some countries, like in France, is the last time I reported on it, which was a few years ago, right? If your business went out of business, you could go to jail. If you couldn't pay off your debts, then that's a jailable offense. Well, that doesn't exist in the US in the same way. And there are lots of other examples of it, right? Like, in Silicon Valley has kind of honed this to a fine point, where they make a huge and deliberate attempt to say a failure is not a failure, it's just an opportunity to change. And you'll see tech companies and tech founders, right? One of their businesses won't work out, well, they'll resurface a little while later with another one. Um, Within a tech company, as long as there's still money, right? They just are constantly changing their product. They do not recognize failure, as failure. They just see it as an opportunity to change. And a lot of our great inventors have that same attitude. Thomas Edison's often quoted there, right? Like Michael Jordan, I think we quoted him in the book, saying, I made like 10,000 shots that didn't hit so I could make the one that did.
Right.
So that's the concept that entrepreneurs really, really take to heart in a very deep way, right? Daily, they hit so many obstacles that other people might perceive as a failure, that might stop other people, but entrepreneurs just sort of flip them around in their head and say, oh, I learned something. How do I adapt?
Right. Right. They're
Yeah.
great points. Great points. Um, let's talk about what's a big theme in your book: women and other minorities, and how we need to get behind them. What do you see as the roadblocks for investors getting behind women and people of color and other minorities? Is it that they can't get enough skin in the game? Is it something else? Is it trust? What is it?
I think it's complicated, which is why we had to tell the story in the form of stories. And that's
Mhm.
the best way to tell a complicated truth is in the form of a story. Um, and I think it has to do with sometimes the institutions themselves are just racist or sexist. And there are lots of stats that show that, for instance, banks loan money at lower rates to people of color, at lower rates to women. And if you go into a bank as a woman or a person of color and ask for $1 million, well, your chances are they'll give you 700,000 or whatever it is, right? You get less money with the request. So there's some of that. Those institutions are just hidebound, right? They live by these old rules that have not adjusted to the fact that women and people of color are now starting most of the businesses in the country. But there are also issues, I can speak to this as a woman entrepreneur myself, right? That women are really not brought up with the same kinds of confidence in the economic sphere as men are. There's lots of efforts. I have two daughters myself, so there's a lot of stuff going on in schools that's trying to like build girls' confidence and that. But in the economic sector, it's particularly hard, I think, and I don't think we've made as much progress helping women feel confident about money, about careers, about being a breadwinner as we have in other sectors. And so, women and people of color get into the corporate world and they're like, "God, this doesn't work for me, right? This sucks. I've got a sexist manager. I've got to I can't advance up the ladder. Well, I'm just going to go off and start a business." But they're really not as well equipped to start a business as we need them to be. So that's one of the things that needs to change.
But I agree, and I think there's a lot going on there, and you're certainly touching more than the surface with your book. But I walk back through my old neighborhood um, at least once a year, and I grew up in the Bronx. And when I went through it, there was a German delicatessen, there was an Italian delicatessen, there was Vito's Pizzeria, um, there was a florist shop, and I walked down that same strip today, and it's a bodega. It's not Maria's hairdresser anymore. It's um, a Latino woman. And so I go through that. I've got the same shops, just with different ethnic owners and different people of colors owning the stores.
Mhm.
So what I try to reconcile is how did they do all that and overcome the roadblocks?
How did the earlier generation of immigrants do it?
No, the current generation of immigrants.
Well, how do immigrants always do it? I mean, right? Immigrants are twice as likely to start businesses as native born Americans. They're just so determined for so many. I think it's a fascinating thing, right? I've written about immigrant entrepreneurs for my whole career, and it's always this question of where do they get that incredible drive? And it's so much a part of our American story. That I love, right? People who are cynical today have not spent a lot of time in conversation with immigrant small business owners across the country who are generally like profoundly positive about being here, like so grateful to have been able to get their businesses off the ground. It's incredibly difficult, but they just keep working at it because it's a shot, right? And how many times have you gotten in a lift and talked to your driver and it's an immigrant or you're a taxi, right? And they're an immigrant and they say, "Hey, my kid went to UVA, whatever,"
Yeah,
right? It's like it is still the American story. It is still happening. We just need to be working much harder to enable it to happen more.
I agree. I agree. It's just a cycle of our immigration pattern,
Yeah.
and
And yeah. I love it that you're from the Bronx, actually. I can totally hear it in your voice. uh,
and
but
I've cut most of the accent out, but I can get into it from time to time.
okay, can you like pick it up right now? Can you like speak to me in Bronx language?
Would that, yeah, hold on one second.
Okay.
Sure can. What do you want me to say?
Okay, that was pretty good. That was cool. Um,
So,
I, no, I was going to tell you one other thing about your observation of the shift over in the immigrant communities, right? Which is one of the profiles in the book is Danaris Mazzara, who started a Dominican bakery outside of Boston. And it was so interesting to me because during the pandemic, she was like right down the street from an Italian bakery that had been there for 100 years. And she's got this Dominican bakery. And they had like this friendly competition going, right? The Italian bakery had 3 locations, it's long established. And she's this scrappy Dominican startup. Well, during the pandemic, somebody decided that the Italian bakery, because it still made bread, although mostly it sold cookies and cakes, but just because it still made bread, it could stay open. And her bakery had to shut down because it just wasn't part of the Dominican community, right? She was making cakes for quinceañeras and for big parties that Dominicans were having. So it's like those kinds of decisions, I think, that we just haven't adapted well enough. We're not recognizing that today's small businesses are serving a different immigrant community, and they have different cultural traditions and different rules.
yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. And we need to pay attention to that more. So what's next for Elizabeth and Seth? Where do you take this journey?
Oh gosh, it's a good question. Well, we're talking about the next book right now, so I'll tell you. Um, this has like been very satisfying because small business books that are serious books about the small business economy usually don't like rise to anybody's attention. I hate to say that, but they usually don't. But ours is kind of hitting the national conversation. We were on NPR and we've been in Fortune magazine on the Zebra. Tyra Banks wrote the foreword to our book, which is pretty cool.
Mhm.
So we feel like we are making a difference. And I think that means we'll write another book. And whether that turns out to be more of a how to book to help people really start Main Street businesses, it may be that, or it may be a book that really looks more in depth at women because they're kind of, I think, the fastest route for us to reinvent our economy in a sustainable way would be invest heavily in women entrepreneurs. So we're kind of thinking of those two options, and others might hit the radar as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, what else would you like to add before we wrap up? Anything?
I don't know. I mean, it was fun. It was fun talking with you. I appreciate
Same
it a
here.
lot. I appreciate your care for small businesses, actually.
Yeah, well, as I said, I have a accounting and then finance background, and worked a lot with. I was in a large corporation for most of my career, and then the last 15 years we had a small consulting practice, and we dealt with mostly startups and turnarounds, which were usually. So we got to meet a lot of good people who had good business models, and if they went a little sideways, it was tough getting that next round. So we had to go figure out what to do with. So we got to hear a lot of stories, a lot of good news, a lot of bad news, and it makes you a little bit real, and it makes you appreciate what people go through, especially when something doesn't work out and they've put years of sweat and sweat equity into something,
Yeah,
and but
yeah.
hopefully
I was going to say, what's your book going to be about?
my book. My next book is going to be pure fiction, and it's about different stages of romance and some of the trials and tribulations that one goes through with that. My first book was a historical fiction on the life and times around Babe Ruth, and
Oh, oh, I love it.
yeah,
That's cool.
written
That's
from the
great.
perspective, if he stayed mostly a pitcher, would he have made a run at Cy Young's uh, unbreakable record of 511 wins? And so the title of my book was 512, and it's got some
That,
interesting twists.
that sounds fun. The romance one sounds fun too.
It does. The romance one sounds very fun. And a timely question with Babe Ruth with tonight's game, right? Right, Ralph? You must be pretty excited for the baseball game
Yes,
tonight.
we couldn't see it, but I do have my
Ah, there
Yankee
you
shirt
go.
on. Um,
Okay.
I'll be rooting
Yep.
hard. I don't give them much of a chance there, but I'm rooting hard for them.
Well, the Boston and New York matchup is always a thrill. Even whether you love them or hate them, either side, it's just a classic rivalry. What sports is all about, really. So.
We're going to chew those guys up.
Yeah. Forgot about it. Forgot about it. Anyway, Elizabeth, what a pleasure to meet you and fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming on ZTV, and thank you for your support and love for the zebra. We appreciate it. We love what we do. Speaking of small businesses, I mean, gosh, between Old Town and Del Rey and all the neighborhoods around Alexandria, there are so many small businesses. It truly is the backbone of the community here. So hopefully people will watch the show, learn a little bit something, and pick up your book, and certainly look forward to the next one.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was great. And
It was
have a
a lot
good
of fun.
night.
Yes.
Thanks, you
Yeah.
too.
Thank you. All right, Ralph. Thanks you and Elizabeth. And that's gonna do it for us tonight. Please come back and join us tomorrow night. We actually have a doubleheader tomorrow night, and residents of Alexandria City are going to be very interested in the Virginia Amos show. Is here for a doubleheader tomorrow night to continue the baseball theme for a second. She'll be interviewing at 7 p.m. Annetta Catchings, who's the candidate for Alexandria City Mayor, and then at 8 o'clock she's interviewing Florence King, who's a candidate for the Alexandria City Council. So please tune right back in here to ZTV Live tomorrow night when Virginia Amos has really wonderful conversations with those two candidates. Then on Thursday night, tune in. It's Lisa Kovac of Alexandria Makers Market will be here on Make It Alexandria with a show on the Misfit Makers, who is an Alexandria-based event company that hosts offbeat, creative maker and seller markets, theme nights, and other fun events. So be sure to tune in here Thursday at 7. Then, until then, and through then, as much as you can, remember to be the good news in someone's life.